So, digital usability engineering and risk assessments. Now, there are three notions that goes on in this sentence here, and I'm going to address them one by one. First of all, I'm going to talk about the digitalization of your technical file. Second, we're going to look at how risk management can be done by digital tools. But I want to focus mostly on usability engineering and what it means to incorporate usability engineering in digital ALM tools in order to facilitate your work with your technical file. Now, first of all, talking about creating and maintaining our technical file, we all know, because we work in this industry, that it's a lot of work. Now, not only because these technical files consist of a large number of documents, but also because the content of these documents have a tendency to be interdependent, meaning that they rely on each other and that they change a lot throughout the development process of the product. Now, we can take a closer look at these documents to try to figure out what are these things that are interdependent and that actually changes a lot and creates this complexity that drives this effort of keeping it up to date. And I have two categories of information in particular that I find to be important. One of them are the design control items. And the design control items are, the requirements, the specs and risks and tests and everything that goes into the product traceability that creates the interdependencies between documents in your technical file. And the other category is text parts that keep reappearing in a large number of documents. And we can have examples like intended use, device classification, UDI numbers. And this information is super important to keep consistent throughout all these documents. So if you change the intended use and it's in 8 documents, you need to update it in 8 places. And here now, an ALM tool or a digital tool comes in to try to solve these kind of problems, to capture and manage these pieces of information, keep them under strict change control, link them up through traceability, which then permits us to do error and gap analysis. And finally, we can use this information together with our document templates and feed these things into our document templates to create the documents that actually constitutes our technical file. And of course, if anything would have change, like in the design controls or usable text components, a tool would then help you to automatically identify which documents needs to be updated, whether they are up to date, or you can then select if you want to update them, just like Martin mentioned previously in his presentation. So where does usability engineering and risk management fit into all this then? Well, both these domains are essentially made up of these interconnected design controls. And I'll try to show you what I mean with this. Usability engineering and risk management, they have several things in common. And one of them is that they should ideally be started early in the development cycle. How early? Here the answer is that you should do it before you've started with a detailed design of your device. Why? Because both these things actually drives our design, which means that we make design decisions based on the outcome of these actions. And now you might ask yourself, like, how can I perform a risk assessment on a device that doesn't exist? Or how can I do usability engineering on something that isn't simply there? And here the idea is that you start out by laying the foundation for your technical file, by establishing the intended use, your intended user, the intended use environment, and these primary operating functions or principles. Now, with these simple parameters, you can start doing the work. For example, doing a top-down risk assessment, and also later on elicit use scenarios. So we start out by digitalizing these parameters in our ALM tool, and then we can use these to start thinking about our top-down risk assessment. We can do this very early on. Now, you have probably done risk management in Excel. I mean, Martin already told us about this, and in an Excel sheet, usually a risk is represented by a single row in this Excel sheet. And we know that the risk kind of makes this journey from left to right, starting out to the left, being identified, and then we go on to the right and it becomes evaluated, and we start mitigating it, and then we can implement it, and then we can verify it. So it clearly makes this journey from being identified to basically being solved downstream. An ALM tool would do something similar like this, but an ALM tool then chops up this row into different components that can be reusable and that can then be combined and recombined in our risk assessments. So this means that we can use this approach of reuse, and on one hand, it will save us a lot of work, and it will also ensure consistent use of information. So just like Martin mentioned, like when we have a given harm, we link that to a severity, we can be sure that every time that we apply a particular harm in our different risk assessments, we can be sure that we assign the same severity and therefore reach a high degree of consistency. So what we do then is that we look at these in fundamental parameters of intended use and the user and the environment and ask ourselves, what could possibly go wrong here? And I can do an example here. For example, is our device going to be used in a moving vehicle? Well, that inherently involves a number of risks. Yeah. Is our device going to be used at night or with poor visibility? Well, that automatically poses more risks. We don't need to know a lot about the detailed design of the device in order to start to think about these risks. Or is the user going to be a child? Can the child read? Or is the user a physically impaired patient, maybe not being able to touch buttons, etc.? So again, these initial assumptions about intended use, user and environment, and primary functions is enough for us to start thinking about risk, thinking about how we want to mitigate the risk, and therefore drive our design forward. And we can do something very similar then with use scenarios. By looking at our initial data, we can start creating plausible use scenarios like this. We know that our device is not going to be used for its primary purpose, but it's also going to be somehow reach the user. Maybe it's getting unpacked, maybe it needs to be calibrated, installed, recharged, etc. These are all examples of how a user interacts with the device and can serve as use scenarios. Now, I consider use scenarios to be the absolute cornerstone of our usability engineering effort, and they are definitely an excellent candidate for being put into a digital tool, and I will show you shortly why. Now, a use scenario, in a sense, is based on a set of tasks. So we can start gathering these tasks as row in a task list. And of course, since we're using a digital tool, these tasks are, of course, reusable, and a single task can then be reused in several scenarios. The next step would now be to analyze each of these individual tasks for possible risk situations, like what could possibly go wrong during this particular task. We can record this in so-called risk events in our system. And now the real fun begins, because now we can create this connection between our usability engineering and our risk assessment. So let's say that we have already started on our risk assessments, our top-down risk assessments. Simultaneously, we are working on our use scenarios. We identify potential risks, and we can now hook in those use risks with our existing risk assessments. Maybe it turns out that the risk team already identified the same risks that we found here in the use scenarios, so no need to write them down twice. We can then reduce redundancies by just hooking up these risk events to already established risks. But of course, since use scenarios is an excellent additional identification method, we might also find new risks here. And the idea is, of course, that by connecting the use scenarios into the risk assessment, again, this helps us to drive the design forward, to take design decisions that mitigates these risks. Now, one thing that becomes apparent here is that when we now have connected our use scenarios to our risk assessments, we can say something about the riskiness of each use scenarios, because we can see how they, through these traceability, then links down with the potential harms in our risk assessments. So some use scenarios are going to be more risky than others, and we can directly see this. And of course, a tool can help us to find exactly those use scenarios that poses the highest risk. And this will come in very handy later. Now, the next step in the usability engineering that I would like to talk about is formative evaluation. Now, what we do in the formative evaluation is to have either experts evaluate early designs of our device, or we can observe how representative users interact with prototypes of our device. Now, this allows us to assess the usability of our device and also, of course, identify risks. Note again that we want the formative evaluation to drive our design, and to maximize this impact, we should start early. Why? Because then changing the design is still cheap. The longer we wait, the more concrete the design will be, and the more expensive it will be to alter our design. Now, however, you need some kind of a representation of your device in order to perform these formative evaluations. It could be a simple mock-up, it could be a sketch, it could be a prototype. And there are essentially two big two ways that you can do this formative evaluation. You can do it expert-based, or you can do it user-based. Now, expert-based is suited for the earliest possible evaluation, where users tend to give a better feedback when they have something that is a little bit more concrete. Now, there are several different methods to perform this, expert-based and user-based methods, and I have just two examples that I'm going to look at later on. But again, how do we select which use scenarios that we want to use for our formative evaluation? Because the idea is that we give either the experts or the users our prototypes or mock-ups of our device and ask them to look at it from a particular user interaction scheme. And the good thing here is that we already have these schemes because we have our use scenarios. So we have already written down the expected scenarios in which we anticipate the user work with our device. And which ones should we then select? Well, we should use a risk-based approach here, meaning that we should foremost look at the use scenarios that poses the highest risk and prioritize them during our formative evaluation. And we can easily do that because we have already connected our use scenarios with our risk assessment, and we can easily then identify which of the use scenarios are connected with either quantitatively most or qualitatively the highest risks in our risk assessment. Now, here is an example of a so-called cognitive walkthrough. This is an expert-driven method where you have a usability expert take your mock-up or prototype in one hand and go through the individual steps in your use scenarios and make a cognitive evaluation on how likely it is that the user can successfully perform each step. Another way of doing a formative evaluation is to perform so-called heuristic evaluations. And this is more like you apply established rule of thumbs that is prevalent in the design community on what is a good design, and you let usability expert then evaluate to which degree your device is compliant with these rules of thumbs. And an example could be, for example, a word that you use in your UI should mean the same thing throughout the entire experience with the device. So you shouldn't use the same notion for the same thing all the time. Or if you use a particular color, for example, that color should mean the same thing throughout the entire experience with the device. Or it could be that it should be obvious in which state your device is. So the user should not have to guess whether is your device on or off, or is it running, or is it in a dangerous state, or is it broken, or whatnot. So these are these rules of thumbs that you can look at your device on and let an expert decide on to which degree you fulfill these rules of thumbs. Or you can, of course, take a more classic route and just have users interact with your prototypes. You observe them silently, then preferably. And after you have the user interact with your device according to some use scenario, you perform interviews with the users, where the user then can share his experience with how easy or difficult it was to perform a particular task, or to find the controls that you were looking for, or read out the results or whatnot. Now, the output of the formative evaluation is qualitative observations. And we want to identify potential use difficulties or closed call or use errors. And we can now feed these observations into our risk assessment. And again, ultimately, let them drive our design, because the risk assessment makes it easy for us to prioritize what kind of observations we should deal with first, which are most important in order to create a safe and an effective device. So we clearly see here that the connection between risk assessment and usability engineering serves a dual purpose. So on one hand, the connection with use scenarios to risks help us to select, prioritize, and identify which use scenarios we should prioritize in our formative evaluation. But based on the findings that we do during this formative evaluation, we will find new things that potentially causes problems with our device. So the risks are both an input and an output of this particular action. And in all cases, again, we want to use these actions in order to drive our design. Now, I have seen cases where formative evaluations have been treated as a part of the design verification, and this is not ideal. So I want to just say a couple of words how design verification and formative evaluation differs here. Now, when we perform a verification, we take our device and we compare it with our requirements and specifications, and we look for quantitative results, meaning we want either passed or failed. And if we have no findings, that's a good state for us. Now, the formative evaluations are different. They do not verify the design, they drive the design, meaning that what we want here is observations. We want feedback. We want to know what the user thinks. And by unveiling these hidden factors, this gives us the opportunity to make a more user-friendly and safer device, and simply an outstanding sales hit. So don't forget that this is an opportunity for you to find the best possible design based on user input. It's also the case that when we perform a design verification, the design is more or less completed. So this is done fairly late in the development phase. And we can then contrast that with formative evaluation that we would like to do fairly early, because again, we want to gather observations that can drive our design, and the earlier we can incorporate these design changes, the cheaper the overall development is going to be. Now, last but not least, we come to summative evaluations. And in a summative evaluation, we don't have prototypes anymore. We use our real device. We also use real users, and we do this in a real environment. And all of this just screams cost and expenses, because it's very costly to engage all these things. You need to build your real devices. You need to engage a fair number of users. You might need to rent the location or where you want to perform this summative evaluation. And all this just costs a lot of things. And we are also fairly late in the game here from a development perspective. I mean, our device is done. Yeah. So any findings that we have in this phase that requires a redesign will be very costly and will probably offset our timelines greatly. However, if you have made your formative evaluation correctly, you should probably have ironed out all the problems way ahead of when we reach this state. So there shouldn't be no surprises for you in this final stage if you have done your homework correctly. Now, here again, we need to make some kind of selection of which use scenarios we would like to include in our summative evaluation. We do not need to include all of them. And again, we can use a risk-based selection because we have already connected our use scenarios with our risks, and we know there implicitly which use scenarios that potentially poses the highest risk. So those are the ones that we would like to prioritize, and it's very easy then to argue towards an auditor why you made this particular selection of use scenarios in your summative evaluation. The digital tool will of course help us to properly record and connect the outcome of the summative testing. So we will end up with a complete full audit trail and end-to-end traceability just by simply applying the regular workflow that such a digital tool would offer you. And last but not least, all the data that we have gathered now, all this usability data, we can use them to construct our documents. So we just grab the Word templates from our QMS and we just insert this usability or risk management data into our documents wherever they need to be. And of course, the digital tool will make sure that the document is automatically up to date, just like we expect them to be. Now, finally, some wisdom about usability engineering, regardless of whether you use a digital tool or not. Now, please take usability engineering seriously, not only because it's the right thing to do, it's because you will save money, all right? Don't treat this as an afterthought or an Alibi-Übung. This is the possibility, the opportunity for you to make your design outstanding. So some practices that I've seen that I would not recommend is to document the usability file retrospectively, meaning that somebody says suddenly that, we're done with the development. Now we can finally write our usability file. Let's just retroactively create those documents and hope that nobody reads them. Something else that I've seen is that, okay, somebody reads the standards for usability engineering and they see that there needs to be some kind of input for the usability engineering, and then they just go into their existing requirements document and they tag some of the requirements as usability, and they say that, okay, this subset of the requirements makes up our usability engineering input. That's of course not the correct way of doing it. It will definitely not drive the design in any intelligent way, and you will not benefit from this at all. Now it's up to you to decide when to perform the formative evaluation at all. But there is so much interesting feedback to be gathered from this phase, and sometimes it's not necessarily what you want to hear, but you will get the feedback from the users and you will get it from experts, and you can choose whether you want to have this feedback early or if you want to have it after market launch. I take great pride in the products that I develop, and I want my users to like my products, and I'm convinced that a product that is user-friendly is not only safer and more efficient, it's more likely to provide sales and income and ways to pay my bills. And finally, the evaluation outcome. Sometimes I see that companies, they perform a summative evaluation and they see that, okay, the user apparently has problems using our device. How can we solve that? We're definitely not going to redesign the device. Just let's update the user manual and add a couple of lines to the user training. We're going to train the user into submission. And that's, of course, not a serious way to deal with this. Now, in the end, I think personally, I'm a bit biased here, of course, that usability engineering and risk management can greatly benefit from digitalization. We have the single sort of truth, we have the automatic change control, the complete audit trail, we can reuse items, we can use the traceability to then let a system automatically find errors in our documentation without having to manually review these hundreds of documents to try to find them before the auditor does. Now, in the end, What we want to create is a complete, correct, and consistent technical file. And I think that for all of those of you who do not necessarily enjoy doing documentation, I can highly recommend a digital tool to do the majority of the work so you can focus on other things.